Well, hello. And we're back for another edition of Becoming a Gibborim. If you haven't seen me in a while, it's because, well, frankly, my life is tumultuous at times. Sometimes outrageously vibrant and wonderful. Other times it's like skin of the teeth close, son. We've been a little bit more in that category as of late, which means we're going to talk about today Hierarchy of Needs. Yep, why that's super fundamental to understanding why you're not going to be the same way you are today as you are when you're living in the wildest times and seasons of your entire life, where you have to think about things like, how do I get water every day? Because you use so much more water than you really think about. And if you don't live in tiny spaces, I live in a rectangle often, as in all the time. I have an RV. We travel around all over the country. It's wild. That being said, I have to think about things like water constantly, electricity. Yep, another big one. And, of course, what to put in my mouth, because I'm ferociously hungry, like tiny cave bears, right up inside my stomach at times. And because of that, I also am going to be probably weeping at certain points in this, because there's a serious need to discuss the things that I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say, hey, get ready for war. Oh, by the way, food, water, electricity, and weeping is basically the most important things you could possibly learn about how to engage in the world around you when it is tumultuous. So I'm probably going to stir up the pot of tumultuousness because I definitely want to talk about Ecclesiastes. And that's just a ridiculous word, isn't it? To most people, they're like, what? I don't even know what you're saying. If you don't know what Ecclesiastes is, as apart from something you maybe heard about once or twice, no, if you haven't dove face first into the mouth of lifetimes of wisdom in the history of the world, more wisdom than anything ever was dumped into that book, and it's bypassed immediately. It's never included in the stories that are in the children's Bibles. You notice that? Ecclesiastes isn't on Sunday morning school felt boards ever, nor is it in the classrooms of any university. And there's a reason for that, because it pretty much just takes a giant swing and decapitates the old American dream, the dream of having enough and being able to be content in things that this world, it basically takes the whole hierarchy of needs that the world tells us is fundamental and just takes it out completely right from the old feet and then totally ends its life. Ecclesiastes just did that to me today. It's one of those moments where, I was crying in the rain. It's one of those kind of days today. Sometimes children and need for water and exhaustion, fatigue, and all of these different things make you just weary. And I was definitely in one of those moments today. And I think it was one of those points where I cried out. You know what I mean? I think most of you, I don't need to tell you about what it's like to just cry out. I think you've groaned and grunted probably plenty in your life, and none of you needs a textbook course on that. But for me, I've had some groany days, and more as of late than as of old. And because of that, it's made me a little raw. It's a little raw, which means I'm liable to get a little more offensive than some of you are really comfortable with. I know some of you would rather I be a little softer, maybe with my poise, when I try to just utterly eviscerate an entire system of debauchery and destruction that's been sucking the souls of mankind into tiny little vessels and trafficking them like currency. True story. It happens every single day when people plug into a system where you're just a brick in a giant development. Sorry, it just got outrageously windy. We're just going to persevere. I hope you can still hear me. Oh yes, you're inside the microphone. You're not out here, so that's good. But today we're going to be also diving back into the mighty men of old. David, for sure. Saul, because he's always got a spear in his hand. I love talking about that guy. That king who always has a spear in his hand. We're going to read about what it's like to have someone who actually seeks your life every single day and how to avoid the pitfalls of fear, lack, and what you do when you're just stuck down in the mire of that garbage, because most of us are, right? That's why you're here. Because the real Gibborim, remember, there was 3 qualifying features that each of them had one of the 3. that made them Gibborim, or got them actually to a point where they were willing to be able to go just get stripped of everything that this world once told them was what they needed to survive, and then instead given a new word from the living Elohim in order to fulfill them and sustain them and empower them to do mighty, miraculous, supernatural, but also just super ordinary dudes. Remember, these are almost always just normal humans. The Bible characters that people think of in their head tend to be like Samson, yoked out, like he's been down in the creatine bottles, just dousing himself in creatine and nitric oxide and just lifting weights. I think Samson very likely was probably scrawny, maybe a little bit. But he did some mighty acts even when he didn't have the strength of Yahweh come upon him. So maybe he was a little buff, but I don't think he was yoked. You know what I mean? I think the vast majority of all the mighty people that we read about in Scripture were bland. They were almost background noise to everybody else's story until one day they really weren't. One day they were so much in the face of, oh my goodness, do you even know that Gideon, he just tore down the altar while everybody was sleeping because he was terrified. Remember, a lot of the mighty people are also terrified constantly. And they're overcoming the innate desire to not trust in an unseen creative power of the living Elohim. It's hard to trust in that when you can't see it. Faith comes with seeing, believing. No, believing comes by hearing the word of Elohim. There's this building character, and that's necessitated for all of us to have any even desire to go forward in days of total, utter chaos and tragedy and despair and hopelessness and massive amounts of violence. That for me, when I was in the military, every man has to tap into kind of a different area in order to persevere and overcome. For me, I bottled up tears. I actually stuffed tears inside my own soul. You can do that. I think most men have been actually doing that constantly. I had a very interesting conversation with a man who shall be unnamed here, and he was in the latter years of his wondrously youthful later years of life, and he talked to me. He talked to me for real after he read my book. I lived in tight, close community with him for months, but I'd been too afraid to actually share my story with him. That sounds interesting coming out of my mouth now that I say it. I talked to you all, right? I talked to I published a book, if you didn't know it, called Snatched from the Flames. I published my whole life testimonial, but it's different when you're going to live in community with people and then they're going to hear about your dirtiest laundry and your deepest shame and also your victories and overcoming and powerful testimonies of people from all over the world. It's a multifaceted work that I did there. But sometimes it makes me hesitant to share it right away. And because of that, I think I've diminished my capacity to actually be able to engage with this person. But at the end, our last week together, he ended up talking to me all about his deepest need. Oh no. He started out by, first of all, thanking me for talking about weeping in my book and openly weeping and talking about the necessity for people to weep and to let that overflow, that valve that we built into ourselves, most likely because of societal norms, which are mass media propaganda weapons to destroy your character and strip you of all your gibborimness, all your chutzpah, right? They channel it into things like entertainment, sports, media, all this just absolute quicksand that you eat like it's suddenly going to satisfy your stomach for more than 10 minutes while you digest it out. There's so much unction in ourselves that is innate because it's a facet of our Creator. It's an image that we bear of Him, and it should drive us forward in the face of things that are difficult, in situations that are absolutely impossible. And because of that, those defining characteristics that we really look for in the Gibborim, they don't look like what we've been told throughout our life. They look like really brokenheartedness. This man was sitting there describing to me how this chapter in my book, I believe it was chapter 26, the Dodge Viper. Oof, that's a real tough chapter. You can listen to it on audiobook. I recorded it. It's on my YouTube channel playlist. That's a brutal chapter. P.S. Hashtag fair warning to you. It's moderately PG-13 / almost R-rated because of it was necessity to describe some of the things that were going down. That being said, he actually got to open up to me because of that and started talking to me about tears. And that tears he believed were being withheld in our body, that were being held back so viscerally, so tangibly that we could not actually get them out. They were locked up, and he believed they metastasized. They turned into something in the body, like cancer and tumors, and they metastasized. They spread in our body. They spread disease, that it actually spreads in our body because of actual situations and things that we've gone through in our life that we refuse to deal with. That there's these massive areas in our soul that we've never touched. Because to unlock that would open up those floodgates, would open up a wave of emotion, an experience, a memory, a time in our life that we have so intentionally built a wall between us and that side that we can't fathom crossing it. That we can't even imagine what it'd be like to go back on the other side of that. Because through that valley, through that unbearable abyss that we see waiting there, is a moment in time that has been fixed in our soul ever since. And I really believe that is where so much of our dis-ease manifests. It is where it comes out of. This is where the spring has its headwaters. If you haven't looked for springs recently, I don't know. Fundamentals. Water. Super critical. Water comes out of the ground, not just your sink. Step 1. Step 2. Find places it comes out of the ground and then follow those back to where they first start coming out of the ground. That's called its headwaters. Because most water actually comes from inside the earth. There's a lot that falls from the sky, granted. But the best kind of water, in my opinion, is called living water. Check it out. It comes out of the earth alive. It's actually alive. It will give your body vitality in a glass or carrying vessel. See previous videos on drinking carrying vessels. You need water, and this is a good way to carry it. I recommend ones with handles, though. That being said, the springs that were bursting forth onto the earth, if you drink from those, the spring, the source, the headwaters, it is electrifying your body. It will start to purify you of disease. Actually, not the tap water, because you see, people in my family's societal structure of just absolute abominations and idiocracy when it came to using their intelligence for good, they just dumped all this poison into the water instead of, paying to store it in the ground. And they used everybody's body as a waste manufacturing treatment plant instead of their own waste manufacturing treatment plants. So because of that, most tap water, most water that you drink, most soda, any basically liquid you put in your body probably comes from poisoned water, with very minuto exceptions. So if you haven't found a spring in your area, you can look one up at any time. Or you can just pray to the creator of springs and ask him to give you one if you don't have one in your vicinity. Remember, Samson slays 1,000 dudes, most likely, boss warrior Philistines. And then he collapses because he's so exhausted from hand-to-hand combat with the jawbone of a donkey as his tool of choice. And he sits his derriere on the ground because combat fatigue is real, son. You're so tired at that point, you can't function. And you go back down into this hierarchy of needs when you're very, very driven out. And you need one thing fundamentally with most seriousness: water. Water. Samson cried out for water after, I don't know that he cried out for help to slay 1,000 humans. But I think he needed water because there's only one who can make water from the rock. And the rock that followed him was Jesus the Christ, Yeshua the King, the rock that followed them in the wilderness. There's a rock that followed the Israelites in the wilderness, if you didn't know about it, and it gave them living water at times. Just, I think there was a character who lives forever, who said, out of their stomachs will flow rivers of living water. I've been thinking about the woman at the well story a bit more right just all the time because I need water. I'm like Samson right now when I'm thinking about things like water. And I need water in my RV, which is not always easy. You need a hose, which means I need pressure, which means I need some kind of system that pumps it into my rig. I've had wells. I've had spigots on the sides of parks. I've had houses, neighborhoods. I've had people that didn't know I was getting their water. I've gotten their water. I had to get creative at times, and sometimes I had access to a really long hose. But most of the time, I've never had access to spring water coming into my house, except for one moment. There was one season this summer when I was living in Colorado, and I got to settle maybe moderately a neighborly dispute over bad water rights and stolen inheritances that smelled like Jacob and Esau all over again. And because of that, one side of the farm had spring water piped to its door, not its door, into its faucets, which went into its bathroom, which came out the sink and you could drink with your mouth. That's the ultimate dream of mine in my entire life, is to just have spring water piped into my house. Well, the water we were on the other side of the farm, where the stolen inheritances were, that was full of sulfur, methane, and lead, which are definitely not things you want to put in your body. The water was so bad that my wife was washing her face, and it would make her face burn. It was actually burning my wife's face. Terrible. That Shabbat, I was Shabbating, and generally if I'm Shabbating, I'm probably in a creek. I love being near water or in water, and so does my daughter. And so we go exploring for rocks and treasures in creeks every chance we get. And we just happened to meet the other owners of the other farm that day, and they asked us about the water, which gave me an opportunity to tell them about our situation. And he literally helped me run like 180 feet of hose. Wait, I can't confirm that publicly. I was able to have spring water piped to my door for a small season in there. And I had spring water that came out of my sink, and it was delicious. And it was definitely not EPA certified. FDA certified. Sorry. The EPA certifies poison too, so. But needless to say, it was one of those moments in my life that I've wanted since the beginning, since the first time I ever tasted a jug of water. And I was walking through the wilderness at one point in my life when I was doing wilderness mentoring. I used to work in the mental health field, which is a minefield of total traps and snares, which is where we're going to get to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But because of that, I was working way up in the mountains. I discovered that working in the city made my soul want to die all the time, and it was a miserable human wasting plant that I was working in. And because of that, I wanted to get away. And my wife managed to find me a job off of Craigslist, which was sweet. I was a wilderness mentor. I got to go up into national forests and to a retreat center where basically there were tiny old cabins scattered in the woods. There's a lot of people out there who are preppers who dream of places like this their whole life. It's not always readily available because there's giant cities nearby or stuff. Like, there's problems with your relocation strategy. But I got to go out there, and they had lots of old cabins and a big lodge and greenhouse and equestrian place for their horses and a beautiful lake that you could paddle around in that bald eagles visited every summer. They flew over my head and dove down and ate fish in front of my face, and I got splashed by bald eagles as they were feeding while on a kayak in the water. It was an epic place. It was a place where, in the beginning of my book, I talk about going and walking around this lake. It was that place. It was a place where the Father really did grab a hold of my gut-wrenching, unending agony and begin to rip it out of my soul. He pointed across the void. Remember I talked about that we look across with those bottled emotions and those poisoned tears that we stuff? He looked across that, and he told me, I am the bridge builder, and I've come to make a way for you where there seems to be no way. And he did. He built a bridge for me there, and he did it in his creation. Because for me, when I'm actually in his creation, when I'm in the mountains, when I'm in a forest, when I'm in an environment where I'm not surrounded all the time by more Babylonian bricks, I have this peace that comes over me that just does not exist elsewhere. I am so much more at comfort in an uncomfortable environment to most. When city folk, when Babylonian bricks come to the mountains and the forest, it eats them up, man. It chews them up so badly, so quickly, because their clothing is not real clothing. Their underwear, if you remember my story on Escape and Evade, their underwear is not even real underwear. You've been lied to about that. Yep. Their clothing is not durable. They're not used to being outside in the sun or clothing, or they don't know what layering is all about, or why wool socks and boots and jeans, long pants, not cotton generally, because I'm from the mountains where people freeze to death in cotton. Wool, son. Put it on your legs. It'll change your life. It's not that durable. I like nylon. If I could have all hemp, I would do nature's nylon, which is hemp. It's much more durable. It's incredible fabric material. It's just not as readily available yet. But I love being in the mountains because it strips everybody else out of that. And because of that, people built like refuges, like retreat centers up in the mountains, camps. They used to be called camps, like where you would go to get away. Well, now most of them, they've been shut down, right? They've been closed because nobody wants to pay enough money to keep it going, or there's just all kinds of political reasons involved. But this place was a refuge. There was a lot of people transitioning out of living in full wilderness environment where families would send their 18 to 26-year-old sons away to the wilderness. They didn't always send them. Sometimes they actually dragged them. They sent snatchers to go and pick their children up out of their beds and muzzle them off, smuggle them off to literally in the middle of the Utah wilderness somewhere. There's outdoor leadership schools and all kinds of stuff with that. There's some really good versions. There's some absolute nightmaric mind control horror stories and massive amounts of terrible decisions and abuse happening in that organization and system. But I believe it's one of the most powerful tools ever to be stripped away from those kind of normal situations and suddenly dropped into a world where you're thinking about, oh my gosh, I just want to sit down on something other than the dirt and a rock and brutally pokey cactus. There's an amazing thing that happens to you when you suddenly do get stripped of, well, there were so many people in the crosswalk today, and I just couldn't even barely fit through it and get through the light in time, and then I got stuck in traffic, and then on my way to the office, all these people cut me off, like all this just rat race that you get into in the city. None of that's there anymore, but suddenly you're way more attuned to the fact that after you hike for a few miles, you're ravenously hungry, and you need to eat immediately. But you can only eat what you can carry on your back, and suddenly your back feels like it's going to break in half because you thought cans of sardines were a great choice. They're generally a great choice. I'm not trying to dog on them. But you can only carry so much lettuce. Romaine lettuce. Not enough. You can never carry enough lettuce when you're on the trail, so you carry other kind of stored goods or dehydrated or freeze-dried foods. Because of that, you're stripped down out of your normal, like, I'm comfortable. I have running water, and when I go poop, it goes straight down a watery abyss, and I never even think about it again. And then it smells like daffodils and lilacs afterwards because somebody taught me about poopery. Yeah. There's not poopery in the woods, son. You got your heel or maybe a small trowel, and then you dig it, and then you have to poop in the ground. It's great for the trees and the environment. If you didn't know that, that's probably why part of the earth is just dying. It's not because we're poisoning it as much with all the Monsanto monstrosities and home fertilizings and lawn care, golf course care. All that stuff's just ruining it. But I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying it's just done so horrifically terribly. It's embarrassing. But if you actually all just went and pooped in your forests appropriately, like there's even instructions in this, if you didn't know it, that tell you how to poop. That's fundamental. You don't even know how to poop properly because you poop in a white porcelain throne and it just disappears down into the void of somebody else's problem down the line. Don't worry, it's yours because most likely it gets dropped down into somebody else's drinking water and then you all drink each other's pee and poop all the time. That's why you need spring water. Needless to say, if you haven't dug a hole and pooped outside, I highly recommend it. Obviously, giant caveat, don't be a doofus about it because there's some places it's frowned upon these days. But it would do good for you to go pee and poop in the woods. Seriously, it would help the trees around you. I went to a farm where they took the composted human manure because then it's just manure, right? You get that? If you eat all this good food, it breaks down all the nutrients your body digests it, and then it leaves stuff that you don't need anymore. But you know who else needs that? The ground it came from. It takes so much to grow food, like an enormous amount of resources to grow food. And if you haven't grown food, you don't even really get that even a little bit. If you've actually grown food, which is interesting, there's a lot of people that are now growing food in waves, which is fantastic. But they're also learning the hard way that I have no idea how to grow food. It's very hard. Welcome to the learning. But if you take human manure, you can compost trees with it. Non-food bearing plants, like there's a farm I was at where they had bamboo, which is the best material in the history of anything I've ever climbed or touched or carry now as a bow staff because it's amazing. You can fertilize bamboo with it and it grows better and happier and it's fuller and richer. And you can do the same thing with your land. If you have land, even if you're in an apartment complex, it's going to be hard for you to find a place to poop, son. I'm sorry about that. But you could be creative and drive somewhere and get that experience. But you need to because it's good for your soul. And that's one of those fundamental hierarchy of needs that nobody really thinks about. Like, what do I use to wipe my butt? Yep, good question. Probably not your left hand because that's a bad day. You've crossed into a bad level of hierarchy of needs when it's hand talk. There's these tiny little wipes. Oh, maybe I'll get one. No, probably not. It's dark and I'm not going outside in that windstorm. There's these tiny little wipes. I think they're called easy wipes or easy towels. EZ towels. They're like freeze-dried, dehydrated wet wipes when you add a little bit of water. Spring water, of course, if you can. Snow, whatever, runoff. Doesn't even matter. But they expand to a little wet wipe. Chelsea and I, those were one of our favorite things in the history of anything we ever brought with us on the trail. Because when you're on a trail, you're going to need your wet wipes. Guaranteed. And if you don't have a wet wipe, well, guess what? You better start figuring out what plants go good on your booty and which ones don't. So those are other little hierarchy of needs. But after your food, water, like place to poop, place to pee, there's this whole other thing like a place to sleep. Food, water, shelter, right? Fire, faith, hope. There's so many different hierarchies of needs that are out there. Maslow's has this hierarchy of, before I get into that, see, I get so enthused. I'm already taken off here into the races. I haven't even read yet. Okay. Yes. Let's just go for it. You know what? I've got knives. I've got holsters. I've got chunks of purple, garnet, potentially amethyst, and rubies. Because did you know you can get an inheritance in creation if you unplug from the Babylonian bricks? That's pretty fantastic. But let's get over to David's story, because he's a Gibborim who is figuring out that whole hierarchy of needs strategy. Hierarchy of needs strategy that David was trying to figure out here. That's why I was back onto the refuge. I was living in that land of refuge. I was commuting there like an hour, hour and a half each way every day into the mountains to get to this little rendezvous point in the middle of the national forest. It was like a private property tucked in the middle of nothing but national forest. That's a winner. It's a dream place. And because of that, my soul was able to be quieted down enough to actually pay attention and deal with what was in here and what was in here and all those things that I'd stuffed and compartmentalized and refused to ever look at or look for anymore in my life. And it was right there in those lakes, in that nature. It was in the creation that he began to let me have peace from my mind, because I didn't have to think about, for me, what's one of those fundamental hierarchies of needs, which is safety. Safety. I don't feel as comfortable as some do in the cities. I was trained in urban tactics, which means I was basically trained how to hunt humans in neighborhoods, which is just different. It's a different battlefield than the sandbox. Well, I guess they hunted people in neighborhoods too, so there's not that different. But SKTs, special kill teams, the way they operate is that they blend in like chameleons right in the normal land of living. Let's just put it this way. I punched a lot of holes in paper with firearms, but I used to poke holes in men. And there's a huge difference between those two battle strategies, right? The long parabolic trajectory of the 5.56 millimeter round as it exits the 20-inch barrel of the M16A2 rifle, and poof, the 5.56 round coming out of the barrel is actually kind of supposed to curve like this, and there's 2 points along that trajectory where your actually point of aim and the point of where the bullet is going to intersect are the most consistent. And there's all this like whole world to firearm land and soldiering that didn't actually apply when it was just dealing with neighbors, right? And because of that, I had a totally different set of massive amounts of baggage in my life, because poking holes in people can wreck your soul, like in a serious way. There is a cost to war. There's a cost to violence that just pays dividends later. If you're really good at compartmentalizing and stuffing all that stuff away, sooner or later, it ekes. It seeps. It comes flooding over that abyss in that canal that you built to try to separate. It comes over the wall, and it rains on your parade. You can be out there living your good life days, and just all of the world of madness and insanity that is violence. Hand-to-hand violence. That is like me trying to put my hand through another guy's throat. You ever tried that? Have you ever really thought about what it takes to do stuff like that, or to try to? I don't want to get too into it. It's one of these things that just sit in your mind and they just eke at you. Like the moment of that just sits there. And I think every one of the costs of being a Gibborim for many of these men, for many of these characters that we read about here, that we're going to read about, Solomon was a man of peace. He's the one who writes Ecclesiastes, right? Well, Solomon had a hitman whose name was Benaiah. He was one of David's mightiest of all mighty men. Remember Pitt with the lion on a snowy day, slaying giants? This guy becomes the assassin for Solomon, so Solomon doesn't have to get his hands dirty, right? Benaiah slays one of David's other mighty men, Joab, the commander of David's armies, and the high priest that once fled into the wilderness to be with David, Abiathar. Like, if you haven't read the entire story of 1 Samuel and all of it, just if you haven't read Samuel, because it used to just be a book. This is before people got lazy and didn't want things to be so big, and it would just take time and energy. The whole Bible's been changed in different kind of unique ways. If you haven't studied textual criticism, it's not to say that we can't trust it, but you must understand that the word that you've been handed, depending on what translation and which text it was derived from, could really not reflect some of the accuracies and the understandings of the stories you can get if you study it for yourself. I've been studying this story, and I started kind of making a map in my mind of all these characters that are moving through here. Like, at one point in time, they're the mightiest of all the mighty men. At another time, they're being assassinated by the words of David because they betrayed him so deeply. Some horrible stories, some brutal situations that take place here, because violence has a mark that it carries upon you, that if you don't deal with it, if you don't confront the radical, intelligent evil that you've faced in your life, if you don't confront that, if you don't tend to that, if you don't let the great physician heal those areas of your heart, it will ruin you. It really will. It steals from you. It's killing you. It's there to destroy you. But I do believe you can have the great physician tend to every area of your soul, and he can bring you back from that brink. David here is about to go through one of those other brinks because he actually has a man hunting him with every bit of ferocity he can possibly muster. And I also have a tiny caveat. I misspoke previously in a video when I talked about soul ties and David and Jonathan when they last said goodbye. I thought that may have been their last time they saw each other. But actually, today is the last time they saw each other. There was another another moment that they had in the wilderness where they got to see each other. And because of that, David got an intelligence download, which was super important. And he gets to say goodbye to his friend. Critical. Now, we're going to jump in here. 1 Samuel 23. Then David, remember, this is just after they helped to avenge Kaliah. This was a town in the land of Israel that was taken hostilely by bad guys. And they went in and smoked those fools and showed them what was up and then delivered Kaliah, which then Kaliah returned the favor by conspiring against David with King Saul, the one with the spear in his hand, to slaughter David again. So David and his men, they're going on the run. Then David and his men, about 600, arose and departed from Kaliah, and they went wherever they could go. When it was told Saul that David had escaped from Kaliah, he gave up the pursuit. David stayed in the wilderness, in the strongholds, and remained in the hill country, in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day. But Elohim did not deliver him into his hand. Now David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life while David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And so just real quick, let's just make that really, really clear. You can have anybody spend every day of the rest of their life thinking and trying to come up with ways to kill you. But yet, David's Elohim, David's living Elohim, would not deliver him into his enemy's hands. This is why David writes so much of the scripture. Do you understand this? David had an understanding about his relationship with his father in heaven. Okay, not Jesse. Jesse was awesome, right? Jesse probably did a fantastic job raising his son. He raised his son up in the ways of Yahweh. That was fundamental because David had it in him from his youthfulness. From as far as we can tell, David was raised under the heading of a man who sought the face of the living Elohim. That's so powerful. Because of that, David was raised up to be a mighty man. But David had a fundamental understanding of his relationship, that it was Yahweh who would deliver him to his enemies, or it was Yahweh who would spare him and hide him from his enemies, even if they were the king with the entire supra intelligence array ready to smoke you at any time. They had confidence. David had confidence. And because of that, David's mighty men had the same confidence that they didn't need to be afraid anymore. You don't need to fear the beast system. Do you get what I'm saying? Some of you have spent way too long studying it. The police state, the mass surveillance networks, Edward Snowden, WikiLeaks, hashtag, oh my gosh, they know everything we're doing. People think way too much about this stuff after a certain point. It's necessary, granted, for you to understand and be not ignorant of the schemes of the dragon and his system that he's building for his beasts. But it's also way more relevant and important for you to study your creator's surveillance system and how he delivers people all the time from people who are actively seeking to murder them on a regular basis. And he kind of laughs in the faces of people that go after his children sometimes. And that's pretty fantastic. I don't laugh in the face of higher principalities, powers, rulers, or authorities. I don't bring any railing accusations against the enemy, nor should you ever. You're actually strictly forbidden from it, because what's a private supposed to be doing to the commander-in-chief, in a sense? Some of you are going to get that. Some of you are going to be like, what? There's people who actually respect hierarchy so much so that they actually obey it. And it's powerful. It creates a very good system in some ways. But we serve in a different kind of kingdom. And if we appeal to our authority, right? If you actually understand authority and strength of appeal, if you're in the proper place of authority, you can appeal to higher authority and have a covering, a standing order over you, that even if you are the private, you can have the same power. You can go in the name of the commander-in-chief. And that's just very, very important to understand, because that's part of your identity. That was part of my identity, what was stolen from me when I was young. I had my identity stolen, and so have basically everybody since they were born, because we were born into the systems of this world, and we've been corrupted and stolen away from the true calling and purpose that we are made to be, which is a Gibborim. So we're getting back to David's other Gibborim friend, which is Jonathan. Now and Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horesh and encouraged him in Elohim. Thus he said to him, do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul, my father, knows that also. So the two of them made a covenant before Yahweh, and David stayed at Horesh while Jonathan went to his house. Wow, see, that was the last time they saw each other. And he encouraged him to be not afraid. It's one of the most powerful things you can ever encourage your brother, is to be not afraid no matter what is coming. Be not afraid. Even if it was the last time we ever see each other. Be not afraid. See, I talked about, the reason I talked about Jonathan in Soul Ties was dealing with Grimmel, which was my battle buddy. And you sit there and you try to think about some of the last words you ever said to your battle buddies, or to the guys that you were with that aren't there anymore. And you think about what your last words are. I don't know who wrote this down for David. I don't know who was the recorder of that moment for David. But I think that's one of the vaguest descriptions of how he encouraged him in Elohim. I want to know how he encouraged him. How do you encourage someone who's trapped in the wilderness? How do you encourage someone who's always on the run? Like, have you ever been on the run? Have you ever actually lived your life in those lower level of a hierarchy of needs? Okay, basically, hierarchy of needs. You have needs in your life on a regular basis. Physical, food, water, shelter, place to poop, pee, place for you to sleep, right? Shelter, covering, somewhere to lay your head and rest. Safety. This is another hierarchy. Safety, this is physical security, but also kind of just emotional security. Then you have a little bit more like a relational needs that are in your life. Do I fit in? Do I have what I need to be content? Am I relationally well? And then it kind of moves up a little bit where you're able to start accessing maybe some of the higher emotions and expressions. And like each of these levels kind of free you up to be able to have a better contentment, right? Until they obviously use this to try to talk towards almost an enlightenment kind of state. But I think it's an inverse pyramid that they're showing here, because I think that clearly our master says if we want to be great, we must be a servant. If we want to be first, we must be last. If we want to live, we must die. He is the inverter of the whole system of the beast. And so because of that, the hierarchy of needs in the kingdom of Yahweh and in his servants doesn't make any sense to the world. It makes no sense. Like, they don't understand it even a little bit, because when you stop serving mammon, that's the God of provision that most Americans, especially most believers, have put their trust in. I still have to contend with the fears of not having enough. I still have to contend with that, because if you haven't read my book, I just wrote a chapter called The Hunger, the last chapter of the book. If you don't even read the whole book, you could pretty much read the beginning chapters, a couple of them, and that one, or just listen to that chapter tonight. That would basically summarize most of the book, but it's all about the hunger, because I had a physical hunger and a need in my life that was intentionally withheld to me. It was like not allowing the dog to be able to get enough bread so that when you let it loose, it would just tear everything apart. That was like the approach my family went with. It's effective at raising feral animals, but it's really hard for people to live normal human lives after that. And it damaged an aspect of an understanding for me that made me so fearful of lack, so fearful of not having enough, that I used to hide food, literally hide some kind of a morsel away all the time. And lately, since some things in the world may have changed, it's a little harder to do that. I used to do a fair amount of preparations, because blessed is he who sees evil and hides himself from it, right? There's a certain amount of preparation that's definitely behooving each and every one of you, but then you start to realize that at the end of the day, you're going to run out of food. You can't store enough toilet paper or food or water, really water. You can't even remotely kind of store enough water for your basic needs. Families use 10 to 15,000 gallons a month. My family, a couple hundred gallons. But we don't shower as often. I just look for springs. And if I haven't found a spring in a while, sponge bath, son. But because of that, they don't really understand quite what it takes to be able to live in that just perplexing land of the other side. It's different. It's very different. These hierarchy of needs that people are working their way through on a regular basis can change at a given moment. When you live on the run, when you live in maybe just in the wilderness, that hierarchy shifts scales drastically. But so too, because of that, I think this is what allows those three main features of a Gibborim: those who are in distress, those who are in debt, and those who are discontented. I believe that stream that you get into out in the wilderness suddenly makes you more like your master. Like, the King of Glory came down, took on flesh, lived on this earth, but he also lived on the run, a lot of it. He was driven out into the wilderness on the regs. Because of that, we, like David, can experience things that you can only understand by being in the wilderness. Because you live out there, you are stripped of it. Because you live out there, you suddenly look at other people's needs and think of, how can I help them? Because you know they're sharing in your sufferings. There's a power, there's a bond that happens when you share the sweat of your brow. Working on a farm together, and you sweat and you're tired and you're exhausted and you're sore. But when you look over and you see the other laborer who's co-laboring with you, you're encouraged. You're strengthened. You're reminded that they too are sharing in the sufferings. And if you know their story, if you know their testimony, if you know what it's like for them or what it's been like for them, that other gentleman who I worked on the farm with, he was in his 70s, okay, working on a farm so that he could live an RV lifestyle. He was working a manual labor job. I was too scared to work manual labor jobs most of my life because I had to deal with some serious pain. My body's literally been broken in ways that most people don't think is physically possible. I got hit by a car recently. Like a car hit me. I dented its frame with my face. Actually, you could see my face and blood and sweat all over the frame, which is just horrific. It launched me yards and yards off the side of the road. I've had some serious amounts of catastrophic injuries time and time again. Dozens of ER visits, surgeries, reconstructive facial plastic surgery when I was young. Like, my whole entire face was taken and rebuilt multiple times. I've been through some stuff in my life, so I got aches and pains. But then I would look over while I'm farming and think about my groaniness and seeing a man who was white-haired and full of wisdom, but way more busted up in different kind of ways because I've not used my joints for decades in that kind of pain. I've not raised 15 children. I have a couple and I'm exhausted. They're brutal. They're a lot of work. They're fantastically challenging at times because once they're on the move, man, you're outgunned immediately. It's incredible. They're a force multiplier. They're good arrows, right? Understand, they're my inheritance. But so too are things like this. Seashells. So look at that. It's like a lifetime shell. This is how he pays me. This is literally what my inheritance is. It's fantastic. Perfect seashells. I was working on a farm in Florida, and I could see this other man laboring next to me, and his body was so crippled. He was having surgery at the time, and yet he was not whining. He was not complaining. He was doing things without grumbling, and that was so powerful of a witness, and it would encourage me. And that's literally what I think Jonathan is doing here, because Jonathan is also understanding that he's living with a man who constantly conspires to murder his best friend. People never talk about what it was like for Jonathan to grow up in a house of conspirators. I do. I know what it's like to grow up in a house where people in your family just plot ways to murder other people every single day. I was raised in a household where conspiring to commit murder was the regular family business, or just blackmail and child exploitation. It depended on which week and which grandpa was hanging around that day. That was kind of the world I grew up in. I didn't as much get to go out to the wilderness until most recently I betrayed all those humans and then scattered abroad their secrets into tiny clues and maps. Reference book. But because of that, I understand Jonathan, I think a lot more than I understand David in this moment, because it's very, very difficult to imagine living with the guy trying to plot your friend's death, and you can't really warn him most of the time. Jonathan doesn't keep showing up and rolling out with Saul to come murder him because I think Jonathan is restrained from being able to see him anymore. Jonathan now lives in a house where all it is anymore is tension and fear and despair and hopelessness, and he's eagerly longing and holding confidence in his creator, making sure that David gets the throne that Jonathan should have. Because Jonathan realized better it is to give than to receive. Jonathan wants to give up even his very throne, even his robes. Remember, he took his garment off, he took his armor off, he gave his authority over to David because he knew that one was chosen by his master to be king. Jonathan had laid it all down. Saul tried to hold and wield the power. Saul tried to maintain the power. If the Father ever gives you power, it may be for a season, it may be till you die. Don't try to hold it. That's what makes you a Gibborim for the other camp. Real Gibborim, give it up. Real mighty men surrender when they're called to. They offer everything they have, and they say, all of it came from you. All of it can be taken away. Do you have that kind of confidence in your life? Do you have that kind of peace of mind of going to bless the very person who's going to take your position and steal away your birthright? He gives it away, and he blesses David with that, and he encourages David because David's going to be on the run for a long time, years and years and years of his life. David's going to have some serious things happen to him, so I better get to reading a little bit more. Hold on. Thus, let's see. I got through like 5 verses. It's okay. It's so exciting. Oh, I'm getting staggered on time. All right. Then Ziphites came up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is David not hiding with us in the strongholds at Horesh on the hill of Hakilah, which is the south of Jeshimon? Now then, O king, come down according to all the desire of your soul, and do so. And our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand." Another conspiracy alert, by the way. Saul said, "May you be blessed of Yahweh, for you have had compassion on me. Go now, make more sure, and investigate, and see his place where his haunt is, and who has seen him there. For I am told that he is very cunning." I like it. "So look and learn all about the hiding places where he hides himself, and return to me with certainty, and I will go with you. And if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah." Then they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. When Saul and his men went to seek him, they told David, and he came down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard it, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. For Saul and his men were surrounding David and his men to seize them. But a messenger came to Saul saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land." So Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore they called that place the Rock of Escape. David went up from there and stayed in the strongholds of En-gedi. Oh man. Come on. That's how Elohim, that's how the living God rescues his son. Did you see that? David didn't have to do it. David definitely was hoofing it at times because sometimes you got to get out of there. But David, at the end of the day, was not spared anything by his own hand. Some messenger came and gave a word that drug an entire army away from surrounding him and closing in on him. There's going to be times in your life where the enemy is absolutely surrounding you, and you know it. You ever get that feeling that you are being crushed, that you are being driven out? You ever get the feeling that you are being persecuted in your life? Well, sometimes I get that feeling because sometimes I know it's actually happening. There's been times in my life where I actually had people trying to murder my wife and I because of the things I talk about here, the things I've written about. I've had people hunt us with every sweat of their brow and every crafty thought they can come up with. And yet I have seen in a moment my deliverer come forth and save us like that. I've seen him do that, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel that pressing sometimes. And for me, the situation out there, being a traveler on the road, is not so friendly for people that are just traveling around looking for fossils. People don't really care for that kind of a lifestyle these days. People want to be fearful and not welcoming. And it's a different kind of experience altogether when you go through that. I tried to get water the other day. Let me just put it this way. And I was treated like I was a carrier of a disease. Who knows? I could be. You could be. All of them could be the enemy. Everybody could be infected. It's a brilliant strategy if you think about it. If you needed to get the whole world ready to a wartime scenario, rationing, total fear of the enemy constantly around you, that the enemy could be anybody hiding in your midst. If you wanted to get the entire world population set up for wartime rationing, pretty good move. And at the same time, not have anyone really to blame, because how do you blame a virus? But because of that, people are a little less friendly and they're like, no, you cannot come get water. I just needed a spigot, and it was very hard to find a spigot sometimes. That's unbelievably difficult. And that does something to you when you just can't find water on the road. It's an incredible amount of worry, though, when people are just trying to kill you and you're just trying to get away from them. The last thing you need to worry about is even that. But I've lived a long time now in that kind of an environment, in those situations. I've always desired the rocky wilderness place that you could go and hide to. But most of my places like that, they turn into the rocks of escape. They turn into a place where I get persecuted and hunted and driven out from. But because of that, you know what I realized? It allows me to meet mighty men. It allows me to meet people. Like, I wrote a blog post called Pearl Hunting. I talk about some of those mighty men that I met along the road. Because of the way I've lived my life, I've got to actually go and be in the houses and break bread with the mightiest heroes that I've ever personally known. And I met the good, patriotic, well-propagandized, media, lambasted Special Operation Task Force, CAG group operate. I've met some of the apex wolves. I've met the other alpha wolves out there. Let's just put it that way. And because of that, those J Projects team leads, those guys, total studs, right? But I met Gibborims like on an island in the middle of nowherevilles at times. And they didn't look like that. They looked like men who had come to a place of conviction in their life that was so deep and so sincere that they had to remove their family out of the Babylonian system to such an extent that they could not afford to function in the normal society. So they just unplug. That's the whole in debt and distressed and that. There's real mighty men everywhere. They're everywhere. The other side recruits for them constantly. And I don't know why we don't, because if you can recruit from the distressed, the discontent, and the indebted, you're going to find the best humans waiting to be found on the face of the earth. That's the master's campaign recruitment strategy. And we should probably start thinking about it in the same way. We should show people, first of all, by the power of our testimony and being so bold and courageous that we go live a freaky, weird, set-apart life, and we're not willing to look like the rest of the world, so that when everybody else is panicking and freaking out about where food is going to come from, where water is going to come from, that we can have a confidence in the one who will sustain us. I waver on that pendulum some days. My poor wife puts up with some amazing amounts of difficulties with me. Sometimes I genuinely have a deep, unbearable hunger that eats at my bones because I was so hungry for so many times in my life that I had fear that I wouldn't have enough, so I partially starved myself one day so that I could eat tomorrow. It was brutal. It messed me up, and I needed healing in that area of my life. And yet in the situations when you go out into the wilderness and you go out in there, it will reveal and percolate up in your soul all of those nasty bits that you forgot to address down in there that you must deal with now. See, it's better that we deal with what it's like to have a fear of not having enough for tomorrow's needs now, rather than the day that you only get daily bread. Remember the people in the wilderness, the heroes, the Hebrews that crossed over? They had to learn that daily bread came down from the sky. It rained manna every day. If you kept it 2 days, it got mold, or a fire broke out for your unbelievable lack of faith and confidence, and it just erupted in your camp. You had to live on daily bread every day, and trusting that the bread will show up again tomorrow, My wife and I have lived that way for years now, and it's not comfortable a lot of times. And some of the mightiest people I know also live on that other end of the poverty side of experiences in life because they've chosen to abstain from a system. My wife and I could plug right back into Babylon anytime and find good, honorable jobs that would require mandatory rape on my family for injecting non-human DNA inside my body that I'm not really happy to do anymore. Go figure. I like being a human. I'm getting used to being totally human. It's wondrous. It's difficult. But because of that, we swing on a different side of that pendulum. And there's times when I oscillate on that. But so much I see, most of the mighty men, they also wrestle with that. They wrestle with those same fears. They wrestle with those same doubts and the insecurities. And so do people on the other end of the spectrum who are wealthier beyond means. They still constantly think about, how do I hold on to it? And how do I have enough to make sure that I will make it till I die? I can't even tell you how many conversations people have that have plenty of means who think about, I just need to have enough so I'm not the rich dad, poor dad. Remember, I'm not saying all financial management and principles of understanding how to use money effectively are wrong. I'm saying a lot of them just came from the beast system, and you need to be very intentional of understanding. Some of us, at times, you may be called to leave everything you've ever had, sell everything you've ever had, and give it to the poor, and go with everything, only what you have on your back, and follow him. And it will make you mighty. If you follow the voice of your master to where he leads you, it will make you mighty. David was narrowly brought out. He was given routes of refuge. He was given a way of escape. But you know what? David was really given confidence. It built testimonies for David. David and his men right now are in a testimony building season of their life. And so are you, and so am I. I'm in a season where my shield of faith needs some extra armor added to it. And you know how he's doing that? By giving me a different kind of inheritance now. I pray to him. And I ask him for answers to things, that he would deliver me, that he would give me the things that I have need for. And do you know how he answers me? I'm not even kidding. First of all, by mighty Gibborims giving me one of the most beautiful tiny little knives that fits perfectly in my hand space, giving me a hand-forged knife. What a great gift. A miracle. I got to meet some Gibborims recently, and I mean that with all sincerity. The mightiest people I've ever known. I'm meeting actual Gibborims on the regs, and that's spectacular. And they tend to weep a lot. They tend to battle and contend with the forces of fear and those chasms that they've avoided most of their life. They've been uprooting that stuff, some of them for days, months, years. Some of these people have been actively going after those horrible places in their heart that have been filled with lies and just uprooting them and tending to the soils of the people's hearts around them. There's some amazing, mature body of believers that is out there. And right now, most of them are banished to their houses. And because of that, they're losing their sense of understanding their place in a community and in a body. But it's going to be okay. Because if you turn to him and study him like he actually is available and waiting to be with you, he can also provide you amazing community, even when it's least expected. So pray wild prayers. I've been praying and talking about different things on armor. Oh, I really want to get to an armor video so badly. But anyways, one of the big fundamental building blocks that I need to do these different exotic materials is high temperature materials. Corundum. And then we have garnet, amethyst. I don't know if these are going to show up very well. Garnet, amethyst. We found some rubies recently. I'm going to have to put pictures in because it's not going to capture it here in the light. But, oh my gosh. My wife and I found treasures. Not just the first time. I've got other treasures. I've got piles full of them. Most people are like, whatever, there's some purple in there. It's beautiful. I've never found rocks that have purple crystals inside them until recently. I had always, in my entire life, dreamed of finding beautiful chunks of coral. Just awesome coral. I love this. To me, it's dense, it's heavy, it's immeasurably strong, and it's ready to stomp your face in if you ever land on it. Horrible stuff. But seashells. These were all like shells of a lifetime. For me and my family, this is the stuff that, like, if you wanted to hang out with us, we're going to be like, look at our seashells. This is the inheritance that the living God gives to us while we're in the wilderness. Because sometimes in the wilderness, the way he answers your prayers is by giving you rocks, is by giving you water. Like, I spent 3 days praying and seeking and asking and physically looking for water. 3 days. That's the longest I've gone in a long time. That's the longest I've ever gone since having 2 children and a wife, and I have to think about that all the time. And everybody forgets that in this story of David and his mighty men, these guys had wives, children, animals, livestock. They weren't alone in the woods. David's not alone in the forest. David has wives and children with him, babies. Meaning David raised baby infants with him, toddlers, which, listen, if you're trying to be sneaky and quiet while you're hiding in a cave, how did they get the babies to even be quiet? Do you think you can pray and ask the slumber of the living God to come upon your babies and they'll be still if you need to be quiet? I think so. But we don't think about those portions of the stories because we're always reading about David and his mighty men. Well, later on, when they get raided at Ziklag, all of David's entire wife, family, children, all of his Gibborim's family gets sacked, stolen, and stuffed away and smuggled in basically human trafficking. So that's what they thought. This is when David almost gets murdered by his own giant killing other men. And then anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself, but they had wives and children with them. They had to think about those things. I've had to think about those things recently more than I have in a long time. And it did a number on me. By that, it made me cry out to my Creator like never before. And you know how he answered me? Before I got water, he led me to a spring and streams of water where there was crystals and jewels waiting for me to find. But I couldn't have gotten there if I hadn't have gone to seek the Lord because I was desperate and I was despairing because I live in a hallway some days and I can't get outside enough in nature. And some days I just simply must get out there and see the nature that is out there. And then he answers me like that. And that for me, these rocks, these stones are what build the bridge that heals my soul. Being out in the water, being around springs, being next to the ground, being in a place that grows food where there's horses, being in an environment like that heals me because it builds testimonies in me. Being in the wilderness for me builds the testimony. Being in the wilderness for Moses built his testimony. Do you remember that he called to him out of a burning bush the first time and he made the ground sapphire stones? Don't forget, the finger of the living creator of the universe wrote on tablets of sapphire for a reason. We all need sapphire. Everything. It's the best. He wrote his own finger of instructions on sapphire. When he spoke to him in the bush, it was in sapphire. Moses was in the wilderness first, and then he was driven out back into the place of Egypt. But then he was driven back out there, and he had confidence that his master would send him back, and he would bring him back there. And Moses' testimony and our testimonies and David's and Saul's and Jonathan's all build in the wilderness. But Saul would go into the wilderness. He wouldn't stay out there and let it become the place that transformed him. But David knew what it was like to be in the wilderness, and he had to learn confidence that his Creator would provide for him, no matter what his needs were. And in doing so, he would heal every fabric of his being. And I believe I got to see that. That man who sat there with me, who co-labored with me, who is looking at his life saying, I wish I could have, I've, for so many years of my life, prayed to be free from anger. I've wanted to be free from anger. And there he sat weeping with me because he felt freed to let those tears loose, to let those tears come out and wash over him and purify him. And some of you need to weep. Some of you need to weep for months and years of your life. Some of you need to weep until you're dead. Some of you need to rejoice, because here's what I'll do. I'll close it out right here. If you haven't read Ecclesiastes, do it. All of it. Read first 1 chapter, 2 chapters, 3. Read all the first 3 chapters as much as you can. All right. He says, this is, remember, David's son. Not the son who grows up in the wilderness, by the way. Solomon does not grow up in the wilderness. David did. Look at the fruit they bore out. Totally different, right? Just saying. Some children need to be born in the wilderness. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? I have seen the task which Elohim has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate and beautiful in its time. He has set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which Elohim has done from the beginning even to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of Elohim. I know that everything Elohim does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it, and there is nothing to take away from it. For Elohim has so worked that men should fear him. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been, for Elohim seeks what has passed by. Furthermore, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. I said to myself, Elohim will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. I said to myself concerning the sons of men, Elohim has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there's no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of beasts descends downward to the earth? I have seen nothing that is better than that man should be happy, content in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? This is why at the end of the day, it's more powerful to live a life in the upside down world where you give rather than receive. Give powerfully the words of life to all of those you can while you can, because really the only thing that is going to make us mighty at the end of days, at the end of it all, is the fruit we stored up in a kingdom that does not rot or crumble. This jewel is beautiful. It's lovely. It was made for me to find. But you know what? It will crumble It will probably outlive me, first of all. But it will. Not forever. But this is a jewel. See, if you didn't know about it, read 1 Corinthians 12. There's this thing called the bema seat of judgment where you get judged and your works, what you did, get judged. That's actually really important. If you didn't know that, you need to know that as a believer. And there's some people who go away from that situation weeping and gnashing their teeth. Not good. Weed, hate, and stubble. And some who enter in by the skin of their teeth, a lot more weeping there, because they didn't store up the right fruit. I'm trying to store up jewels because everything that I ever done, everything that you ever do, all of your life's work, all of the mighty deeds, at the end, at the very end, when you're going to return to dust, because you are, when you go, all you'll get to take with you are the works that you stored up in places that you cannot see. And all of those get cast into a fire. And all that doesn't get burned up, wheat, hay, stubble, chaff. But then there will be precious stones that were remaining. There's jewels that are waiting for us, that are stored up. That is what we contend for. That is what we seek. The mightiest of men, the main thing that separated Benaniah, the mighty man who's with David in the wilderness right now, Benaniah, Joab, and Abiathar, two of them are going to be murdered by the one hand of the other best friend. Why is that going to happen? Because at the end, their fruit was borne out. They may have done some good at their life, but you know what? At the end of it, they betrayed their king. Be faithful always, even unto death, right? Don't betray him at the end because it will sour your fruit. And some of that fruit that could have been jewels will instead be turned to wheat, hay, and stubble. So be vigilant. Cross over those horrifying places that you've buried in your soul. Deal with them. Contend with them. If the Father blesses you enough to give you lack in your life, let it come all the way, full on, so you can learn what it takes to survive, what it's going to take to sustain you, because man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the Father's mouth. And if you don't know that, if you don't really believe that, if this word doesn't matter that much to you, you need to go and get away from the systems that have ensnared your soul and find freedom in the wild way of the wilderness. Be willing to be courageous. I pray you be vigilant out there. And I really ask, be safe out there. And by that, I mean live as strategically dangerously as possible every single day of your life, because the days are evil, but you were born for such a time as this. I love you. Be steadfast and faithful, even unto death.